May 1st, 1943. 30,000 feet above the English Channel, a wall of fire explodes through the radio compartment. Flames rip through aluminum like paper. Ammunition boxes detonate. Bullets fly in every direction. 3 men leap into the void, disappearing into the gray ocean below. 2 others lie bleeding, unable to move. And in the middle of this inferno stands one man. He is 5 feet 6 inches tall. He weighs 130 pounds. His hair is already gray at 32 years old. His name is Maynard Smith. Everyone calls him Snuffy. This is his first combat mission. He has been in England for exactly 6 weeks, and right now, he is the only person standing between life and death for everyone still on this aircraft. The pilots cannot help him. They are trapped in the cockpit, cut off by a wall of flames. The gunners cannot help him. They are either wounded, dead, or floating somewhere in the channel below. German FW-190 fighters are circling like sharks, moving in for the kill. For the next 90 minutes, this man will fight fire with his bare hands. He will man machine guns on both sides of the aircraft. He will throw exploding ammunition out of burning holes in the fuselage. He will do things that trained firefighters would call impossible. When it is over, Maynard Smith will become the first enlisted airman in United States history to receive the Medal of Honor. But here is the twist that nobody expected. When the Secretary of War flew across the Atlantic Ocean to personally hang that medal around his neck, they could not find him anywhere on the base. After a frantic search, they finally discovered him in the kitchen. He was peeling potatoes. Punishment for showing up late to a briefing. This is the story of the hero nobody liked. To understand what happened on May 1st, 1943, you first need to understand what American bomber crews were facing in the skies over Europe. The 8th Air Force had a problem. A massive problem. And that problem was killing young Americans at a rate that threatened to break the entire strategic bombing campaign. In early 1943, the average life expectancy for a B-17 crew member was 15 missions. Think about that for a moment. If you were assigned to a bomber squadron, you had a statistical likelihood of dying before you completed your tour of duty. The Army Air Forces required crews to fly 25 missions before they could go home. Simple math told every airman the truth. Most of them would never see mission number 25. The targets were heavily defended. German anti-aircraft guns, called flak by American airmen, filled the sky with exploding shells. German fighter pilots had become experts at destroying the big American bombers. They knew exactly where to aim. They knew the weak spots. They knew how to turn a flying fortress into a falling coffin. But the most terrifying threat was fire. B-17 bombers carried thousands of gallons of aviation fuel in their wings. They carried hundreds of pounds of ammunition for their machine guns. A single incendiary round in the wrong place could turn the entire aircraft into an inferno within seconds. Fire killed more bomber crews than any other cause. When a B-17 caught fire at altitude, the crew had minutes, sometimes seconds. The standard procedure was simple. Get out, bail out, jump, because nobody could fight a fire at 30,000 feet. The wind was too strong. The oxygen was too thin. The flames spread too fast. If your aircraft caught fire, you abandoned it. That was the rule. That was the training. That was what every airman understood. But nobody told Snuffy Smith about that rule. Maynard Harrison Smith was born on May 19, 1911, in Cairo, Michigan. His father was a successful attorney. His mother was a school teacher. By small-town Michigan standards, the Smiths were wealthy, and young Maynard knew it from the very beginning. From an early age, he developed a reputation. Spoiled, entitled, difficult. The kind of kid who believed rules applied to everyone except himself. His parents saw the problem. They tried to fix it. They sent him to Howe Military Academy in Indiana, a boarding school specifically designed to instill discipline in difficult boys. It was supposed to straighten him out. It did not work. Maynard graduated, but his personality remained exactly the same. He bounced between jobs after school. The U.S. Treasury Department, the Michigan Banking Commission. Nothing stuck. Nothing held his interest. In 1929, he got married. By 1932, he was divorced. He drifted through his 20s without purpose, without direction, without any clear idea of what he wanted from life. Then his father died in 1934, and Maynard Smith made a decision that would define the next several years of his existence. He quit his job, he collected his inheritance, and he simply stopped working. No employment, no responsibility, just a man in his 30s living off his dead father's money, convinced he was smarter than everyone around him. The money lasted longer than it should have, but eventually the well ran dry, and then came the court case that changed everything. By 1942, Maynard Smith had a serious problem. He had failed to pay child support, repeatedly. The court was not amused. A judge looked at this 31-year-old man, unemployed, arrogant, completely unwilling to meet his basic obligations, and presented him with two options: prison or the military. Maynard chose the military, not because he felt called to serve his country, not because he wanted to fight the Nazis, not because of patriotism or duty or honor. He enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Forces on August 31, 1942, because it was better than going to jail. But here is something the Army Air Forces needed desperately in 1942: aerial gunners. The bombing campaign over Europe was consuming air crews at a horrific pace. Young men were dying faster than replacements could be trained. And aerial gunners, the men who manned the machine guns on B-17 bombers, had one of the most dangerous jobs in the entire war. They also received automatic promotions to non-commissioned officer rank. Better pay, better status, better quarters. Maynard Smith looked at those benefits and made another calculated decision. He volunteered for aerial gunnery school. Not for glory, not for adventure, for the paycheck. After completing his training, Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith was shipped to England and assigned to the 423rd Bombardment Squadron, 306th Bomb Group, based at RAF Thurleigh in Bedfordshire. His reputation preceded him across the Atlantic Ocean. Within days of arriving, Smith had managed to alienate almost everyone on the base. He was obnoxious. He was insubordinate. He was absolutely convinced of his own superiority, despite having zero combat experience. He argued with officers. He insulted fellow enlisted men. He acted as if the entire war was an inconvenience designed specifically to annoy him. The other airmen started calling him Snuffy, after a character from a popular comic strip called Barney Google and Snuffy Smith. The comic character was shiftless, bad-tempered, and had no ambition other than to live life on his own terms while avoiding any real work. The nickname fit perfectly. Here is how unpopular Snuffy Smith was. In the 8th Air Force, replacement gunners were usually assigned to combat crews within days of arriving at their base. Losses were so high that experienced crews were constantly looking for new men to fill empty positions. Bombardment groups could not afford to leave aircraft grounded for lack of gunners. Nobody wanted Snuffy Smith. For 6 weeks, he sat at Thurleigh while other replacement airmen flew mission after mission. Crews would rather fly short-handed than take him along. 6 weeks. In a combat zone where men died every single day. That is how much his fellow airmen despised him. But war does not care about popularity contests. Eventually, someone had to fly with him. On the last day of April 1943, the mission board went up at Thurles. Target: the German submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire, France. Every airman who saw that name felt their stomach drop. Saint-Nazaire was one of the most heavily defended targets in all of occupied Europe. The submarine pens there were built from reinforced concrete, sometimes 20 feet thick. American bombs could not penetrate them, but the bombers kept going back, trying to hit the support facilities, the supply lines, anything that might slow down the German U-boat campaign that was strangling Britain. American air crews had their own name for Saint-Nazaire. They called it Flak City. The sheer volume of anti-aircraft fire over that target was legendary. Bombers came back with hundreds of holes. Bombers did not come back at all. It was a mission that veterans dreaded and rookies feared. Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith was assigned to fly as ball turret gunner on a B-17F, piloted by First Lieutenant Lewis P. Johnson. This was Johnson's 25th mission, his final mission, the last flight of his combat tour. After this, he was going home to America, to safety, to a life where nobody was trying to kill him every day. The rest of the crew were also veterans. They knew what they were doing. They knew how to survive over Flak City. They knew all the tricks, all the procedures, all the small decisions that kept men alive. Smith was the only rookie on the aircraft. At 0300 hours on May 1st, the crews were awakened for their morning briefing. Despite overcast skies and steady drizzle, the mission was a go. 78 B-17 flying fortresses would cross the English Channel, bomb the submarine pens, and return home. At least, that was the plan. The Sperry ball turret was the most claustrophobic position on a B-17. It was a glass and metal sphere mounted on the belly of the aircraft, hanging in space beneath the fuselage. The gunner sat inside with his knees pulled up to his chest, his body curled around two 50-caliber machine guns. He rotated the entire turret to aim at attacking fighters. The view was spectacular. You could see everything beneath the aircraft, the landscape scrolling past, the clouds, the earth 30,000 feet below. The experience was terrifying. You were completely exposed, hanging in empty air with nothing but thin plexiglass between you and certain death. Most ball turret gunners were chosen specifically for their small size. At 5 feet 6 inches and 130 pounds, Snuffy Smith fit the profile perfectly. He climbed into the turret as Lieutenant Johnson's B-17 lifted off from Thurles and headed south toward France. The mission to Saint-Nazaire went smoothly. The formation encountered less resistance than expected over the target. They dropped their bombs on the submarine pens and turned for home. 2 hours later, they were approaching what they believed was the southern coast of England. They were wrong. The lead navigator had made a catastrophic error. In the heavy cloud cover and poor visibility, he had misidentified the coastline below. He thought they were approaching friendly territory. He thought they were almost home. He was mistaken by nearly 200 miles. They were not over England. They were still over France. Specifically, they were over Brest, another heavily fortified German position on the northwestern tip of the Breton Peninsula. The formation began descending through the clouds, dropping to 2,000 feet for what they thought was their approach to home base. That is when the flak opened up. German anti-aircraft batteries below recognized the American bombers instantly. They had been tracking them on radar. They were waiting. Dozens of guns opened fire simultaneously. The sky turned black with exploding shells. Fighters scrambled from nearby airfields to intercept. Within minutes, the formation was fighting for its life. And Lieutenant Johnson's B-17 took the worst of it. 20-millimeter cannon shells from German fighters ripped through the fuselage like it was made of cardboard. The fuel tanks in the wings were punctured. Aviation gasoline began pouring into the aircraft. A massive fire erupted in the radio compartment and spread instantly to the waist section. The aircraft's oxygen system was destroyed. Vital control cables were severed. Smoke filled every compartment. In the ball turret, Snuffy Smith suddenly found himself trapped. The turret had lost electrical power. It would not rotate. He was stuck in a useless glass bubble underneath a burning airplane, 30,000 feet above enemy territory. He had to get out. He cranked open the ball turret hatch manually and pulled himself up into the fuselage. What he saw was chaos. Fire everywhere. Smoke so thick he could barely see his hand in front of his face. The radio compartment was an inferno. The waist section was burning. Ammunition was cooking off, exploding randomly, sending hot metal flying in every direction. 3 of his crewmates, Technical Sergeant Henry Bean, Staff Sergeant Robert Folliard, and Staff Sergeant Joseph Bukacek, looked at the situation and made their decision. They bailed out. They jumped through the flames and out of the aircraft, disappearing into the English Channel below. They were never seen again. But Snuffy Smith did not jump. The man nobody wanted to fly with, the soldier everyone despised, the troublemaker who had spent 6 weeks unable to find a crew, made a different choice. He decided to fight. In Part 2, we will see what happened during the next 90 minutes. How one man fought fire, fought German fighters, and fought to keep his wounded crewmates alive. How he did things that should have been impossible. And how the soldier nobody wanted became the first enlisted airman in history to receive the Medal of Honor. In Part 1, you met Maynard Snuffy Smith, the soldier nobody wanted to fly with. A 32-year-old troublemaker who joined the Army Air Forces to avoid prison. A man so unpopular that he sat at his base for 6 weeks because no crew would accept him. On May 1, 1943, his B-17 was hit over France. Fire erupted through the fuselage. 3 crewmen bailed out. 2 others lay wounded. The pilots were trapped in the cockpit. And Snuffy Smith, on his very first combat mission, made a choice that defied every rule of aerial combat. He decided to fight. What happened over the next 90 minutes should have been impossible. The standard procedure for a burning aircraft at 30,000 feet was simple. Get out. Bail out. Save yourself. Nobody fights a fire at that altitude. The wind is too strong. The oxygen is too thin. The flames spread too fast. Every airman knew this rule. Every training manual confirmed it. Snuffy Smith never read that manual. And what he did next would earn him the highest honor America can bestow on a soldier. The fire had already consumed the radio compartment. Flames were spreading toward the waist section, where Smith now stood. The heat was unbearable. Smoke filled every inch of the fuselage, turning the interior into a black nightmare, where he could barely see 3 feet in front of his face. The roar of the flames mixed with the howl of wind, screaming through dozens of holes in the aircraft's skin. And then there was the ammunition. B-17 bombers carried thousands of rounds of .50 caliber machine gun ammunition. That ammunition was now cooking off in the heat. Bullets were exploding in every direction. Hot brass and shrapnel flew through the smoke like angry hornets. Any one of those rounds could kill him instantly. Any one of those explosions could tear through his body and end everything. Smith grabbed the first fire extinguisher he could find. He pointed it at the flames and squeezed the trigger. White foam sprayed into the inferno. For a moment, the fire seemed to retreat. Then it roared back, stronger than before. The extinguisher ran empty in seconds. He threw it aside and grabbed another one. Same result. Empty. Useless. The fire kept spreading. But Snuffy Smith did not stop. He found a third extinguisher, then a fourth. Each one bought him precious seconds. Each one pushed the flames back just enough to keep them from reaching the fuel tanks. If that fire reached the main fuel supply in the wings, the entire aircraft would explode. Everyone still aboard would die instantly. There would be nothing left but scattered debris falling into the English Channel. Smith knew this. Every airman knew this. The fuel tanks were the death sentence. Keep the fire away from the tanks. Keep fighting. Keep spraying. Keep moving. The extinguishers ran out. Now Snuffy Smith faced the fire with nothing but his bare hands and whatever he could find in the burning wreckage. He grabbed clothing, blankets, anything that was not already on fire. He beat at the flames like a man possessed. The heat burned through his gloves. It scorched his face and hands, but he kept swinging. Then he heard the sound that every bomber crewman dreaded, the high-pitched scream of diving aircraft engines. German fighters, FW-190s, had spotted the crippled B-17 trailing smoke across the sky. They were moving in for the kill. Smith ran to the left waist gun. The .50 caliber Browning was still mounted in its position, pointing out through an open window into the gray sky. He grabbed the handles, swung the barrel toward the approaching fighters, and opened fire. The gun roared. Tracer rounds streaked toward the German aircraft. One FW-190 broke off its attack, banking hard to avoid the stream of bullets. Smith kept firing until the gun went silent. He sprinted across the fuselage to the right waist gun and fired from that position. Another burst. Another German fighter veering away. Then he ran back to fight the fire. For 90 minutes, Maynard Smith fought a three-front war simultaneously. Fire on one side, German fighters on the other, and a wounded crewman who needed constant attention. The tail gunner, Sergeant Roy Gibson, lay bleeding in the rear of the aircraft. He had been hit multiple times during the initial attack. He could not move. He could not help. He could only watch as this small, gray-haired staff sergeant ran back and forth through smoke and flame, somehow keeping everyone alive. Smith checked on Gibson between firefighting and combat. He bandaged wounds. He stopped bleeding. He spoke words of encouragement, promising that they would make it home. Then he turned back to the fire and kept fighting. The ammunition continued to explode. Boxes of .50 caliber rounds were cooking off in the heat, sending bullets flying through the compartment. Smith made another decision that should have gotten him killed. He grabbed the burning ammunition boxes with his bare hands and threw them out of the aircraft. One by one. Box after box. He picked up explosives that were literally detonating and hurled them through holes that the fire had burned in the fuselage. Every pound he removed made the aircraft lighter. Every explosive he threw out was one less bomb inside the cabin. The burned metal seared his palms. The heat blistered his skin. He kept throwing. The fire reached a section of debris that was blocking his access to the worst of the flames. Burning wreckage had piled up near the fuel tank area. Smith could not get past it to fight the fire beyond. He could not use extinguishers because there were none left. He could not beat at it because the flames were too intense. So he stripped off his heavy flight jacket, wrapped it around his arms, and crawled into the burning debris. He pulled away melting aluminum and smoldering insulation with his protected hands. He cleared a path through the wreckage, inch by inch, fighting toward the heart of the fire. When even that was not enough, Maynard Smith did something that would become legendary in Air Force history. He urinated on the flames. Whatever worked, whatever kept the fire from spreading, whatever gave them another minute of survival. Pride meant nothing. Dignity meant nothing. Survival was everything. Up in the cockpit, Lieutenant Lewis Johnson had no idea what was happening behind him. The wall of fire had cut him off from the rest of the crew. He could not communicate with anyone in the rear compartment. He did not know who was still alive. He did not know that anyone was fighting to save the aircraft. He only knew one thing. His B-17 was still flying. Somehow, despite the damage, despite the fire, despite the German fighters still taking shots at them, the aircraft remained airborne. The controls were sluggish. Cables had been severed. Hydraulics were failing. Johnson nursed the crippled bomber westward, praying they would reach England before the aircraft fell apart completely. Every minute felt like an hour. The English Channel stretched beneath them, gray and cold and endless. Johnson watched his instruments, coaxing every bit of performance from his dying aircraft. The fuel gauges dropped steadily. The engine temperatures climbed into the danger zone. But the B-17 kept flying. Behind him, unknown to Johnson, Snuffy Smith had finally gained the upper hand against the fire. After more than an hour of continuous fighting, the flames began to die. The fuel had burned off. The ammunition had either been thrown overboard or had finished exploding. The wreckage had been cleared. Smith had beaten the fire with extinguishers, clothing, blankets, his bare hands, and finally, his own body fluids. The aircraft was still filled with smoke. The interior was a charred ruin. But the fire was out. Finally, they crossed the English coastline. Johnson spotted an airfield below. Predannock, on the southwestern tip of Cornwall. It was an emergency strip, designed for exactly this kind of situation. Damaged aircraft that could not make it back to their home bases. Johnson lined up for landing, lowering what remained of his landing gear, praying the hydraulics would hold. The B-17 touched down on the runway. For one moment, it seemed like everything would be fine. Then the fuselage broke in half. The aircraft structure, weakened by fire and riddled with thousands of holes, simply could not take the stress of landing. The bomber split into two pieces on the runway, the front section separating from the rear in a shower of sparks and torn metal. Rescue crews raced toward the wreckage, expecting to find bodies. What they found was Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith, standing in the debris. He was covered in soot. His hands and face were burned. His uniform was charred and torn. But he was alive. So was the tail gunner he had been treating for 90 minutes. Sergeant Roy Gibson had survived because Smith had kept him alive, kept him stable, kept fighting to save him even while battling fire and German fighters. So were the pilots who had been trapped in the cockpit. Lieutenant Johnson and his co-pilot had survived because Smith had kept the fire from reaching the fuel tanks, had kept the aircraft from exploding in midair. The rescue crews counted the damage. Over 3,500 bullet holes and shrapnel impacts in the aircraft. The B-17 would never fly again. It was nothing but scrap metal now. But the men inside had survived. Lieutenant Johnson was direct in his assessment when he filed his report. He stated clearly and without hesitation that Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith was solely responsible for the return of the aircraft and the lives of everyone aboard. Without his actions, they would all be dead. The story of Snuffy Smith spread through the 8th Air Force like wildfire. Here was a first mission gunner who had done the impossible. A man who had fought fire at 30,000 feet when every rule said to bail out. A man who had manned machine guns against German fighters while simultaneously extinguishing an inferno. A man who had thrown exploding ammunition out of a burning aircraft with his bare hands. And he was the soldier nobody had wanted to fly with. The Army Air Forces saw something in this story, They saw a propaganda opportunity. America in 1943 needed heroes. The war was far from won. Young men were dying every day over Europe and the Pacific. The public needed stories of courage, stories of ordinary men doing extraordinary things, stories that proved American soldiers could overcome any obstacle. Snuffy Smith's story was perfect. An unlikely hero, a man with a checkered past, a troublemaker who found redemption in the worst moment of crisis. The brass began preparing paperwork for the highest honor available, the Medal of Honor. If approved, Maynard Smith would become the first enlisted airman in United States military history to receive the award. The first in the entire history of American aviation. Not pilots with years of experience, not officers with distinguished records. A staff sergeant on his first combat mission who had been too unpopular to get assigned to a crew. Word came down from Washington. The Secretary of War himself, Henry Louis Stimson, would fly to England to personally present the medal. A ceremony would be arranged at Thurley. Press would be invited. Photographers would document the moment. This would be front-page news across America. There was just one problem. On July 15, 1943, when Secretary Stimson arrived at RAF Thurley with the Medal of Honor in his pocket, nobody could find Snuffy Smith anywhere. In Part 3, you will discover where they finally found him. You will learn what happened in the months after the medal ceremony, and you will see how the hero nobody liked managed to get himself demoted, despite wearing the highest military decoration in America around his neck. Because Snuffy Smith was about to prove that heroism and personal responsibility are two completely different things. In Part 1, you met Maynard Snuffy Smith, the soldier nobody wanted. A troublemaker who joined the military to avoid prison. A man so unpopular that no crew would fly with him for 6 weeks. In Part 2, you watched him do the impossible. For 90 minutes over the English Channel, he fought fire, fought German fighters, and saved everyone still aboard his burning B-17. His actions earned him the Medal of Honor, the first ever awarded to an enlisted airman in American history. The Secretary of War himself flew across the Atlantic Ocean to present that medal. A ceremony was arranged. Press was invited. Cameras were ready. And then, they could not find Snuffy Smith anywhere on the base. What happened next would prove something that historians still debate today. Heroism and character are not the same thing. A man can save lives in the morning and destroy his own career by afternoon. Maynard Smith was about to demonstrate this truth in the most spectacular way possible. The search began at 0900 hours on July 15, 1943. Secretary of War Henry Louis Stimson had arrived at RAF Thurley with an entourage of officers, photographers, and journalists. This was supposed to be a historic moment, the first Medal of Honor for an enlisted airman, front-page news across America, a propaganda victory that would boost morale on the home front. Everything was ready. The podium, the microphones, the assembled crowd of airmen standing at attention. Everything except the guest of honor. Officers fanned out across the base. They checked Smith's barracks. Empty. They checked the mess hall. Nothing. They checked the flight line, the recreation facilities, the medical station. Nobody had seen Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith that morning. The minutes ticked by. Secretary Stimson waited with growing impatience. The photographers shifted nervously. The journalists exchanged confused glances. This was unprecedented. Medal of Honor recipients did not simply disappear on the day of their ceremony. Finally, someone thought to check the kitchen. There he was. Staff Sergeant Maynard Harrison Smith, Medal of Honor recipient, hero of the 8th Air Force, standing over a mountain of potatoes with a peeler in his hand. KP duty, kitchen patrol. The classic military punishment for minor infractions. Smith had been late returning from a pass the previous week. His commanding officer, fed up with his constant disciplinary problems, had assigned him to potato duty as punishment. When the morning of the ceremony arrived, Smith had simply reported for his assigned duty. He had completely forgotten about the medal. That was Snuffy Smith in a nutshell. He had performed one of the most heroic acts in the history of aerial combat. 2 months later, he was still getting in trouble for the same petty violations that had defined his entire military career. They pulled him out of the kitchen. They cleaned him up. They rushed him to the ceremony, still smelling faintly of potato starch. Secretary Stimson hung the Medal of Honor around his neck while cameras flashed and journalists scribbled notes. Maynard Smith became a legend that day. But the legend and the man were two very different things. The press loved the story. Andy Rooney, the young Stars and Stripes reporter who would later become famous on 60 Minutes, wrote a front-page article about Snuffy Smith's heroism. The Office of War Information turned Smith into a symbol of American courage. He was interviewed. He was photographed. He was celebrated across the nation. Back at Thurley, the reality was far more complicated. Smith flew 4 more combat missions after receiving the Medal of Honor. Each one took its toll. The stress of that first mission, the 90 minutes in hell, had left invisible scars that nobody could see. He began showing symptoms that military doctors called operational exhaustion. Today, we would recognize it as combat stress, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. He was permanently grounded. No more flying. No more combat. The most decorated enlisted airman in the 8th Air Force was confined to ground duties for the remainder of his tour. And then his behavior problems exploded. Without the structure of combat missions, without the focus that flying provided, Snuffy Smith reverted to exactly who he had always been: difficult, arrogant, insufferable. He started signing his letters with the initials CH after his name, standing for Congressional Honor, mimicking the way British officers displayed their decorations. Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith, CH, as if the medal made him royalty. He used his hero status to skip duties. He slept late while other men reported for morning formations. He avoided work assignments by reminding everyone that he was a Medal of Honor recipient. Surely such a decorated hero should not have to perform menial tasks like everyone else. The other airmen at Thurley watched this transformation with disgust. Many of them had flown dozens of missions. Many of them had lost friends, lost crewmates, lost parts of themselves over the skies of Europe. They did their duties without complaint. They followed orders. They showed up on time. And here was Snuffy Smith, wearing the highest honor their country could bestow, acting like the rules did not apply to him. His commanding officers tried to manage him. They gave him warnings. They assigned him to various duties, hoping something would stick. Nothing worked. Smith continued to show up late. He continued to argue with superiors. He continued to believe that his medal made him untouchable. The tension built throughout 1944. Report after report documented his failures. Counseling sessions accomplished nothing. Disciplinary actions had no effect. The Medal of Honor hung around his neck like a shield, protecting him from consequences that would have destroyed any other soldier's career. But even heroes have limits. On December 17, 1944, the impossible happened. Staff Sergeant Maynard Harrison Smith was formally reduced in rank, demoted, busted down from staff sergeant to to private for poor job performance and continued disciplinary problems. A Medal of Honor recipient. Demoted. This almost never happens. The Medal of Honor carries weight that transcends normal military protocol. Recipients are saluted by officers of any rank. They receive privileges that ordinary soldiers can only dream of. To demote such a man requires documentation so overwhelming, behavior so egregious, that no other option remains. Snuffy Smith had achieved that distinction. He had managed to make himself so unbearable, so impossible to work with, that the Army stripped him of his rank despite the medal hanging around his neck. The reaction across the 8th Air Force was mixed. Some felt justice had been served. Others worried about the message it sent. How could America celebrate a hero one day and demote him the next? What did that say about the military's values? But most who knew Smith personally understood. The hero of May 1st, 1943, and the soldier of December, 1944, were the same man. He had always been difficult. He had always believed rules applied to everyone except himself. The Medal of Honor had not changed his character. It had only amplified his worst tendencies. Smith was sent home in February 1945. He received his discharge in May, just as the war in Europe ended. Despite the demotion, despite the disciplinary problems, despite everything that had happened at Thurleigh, he returned to America as a hero. His hometown of Cairo, Michigan, welcomed him with a parade. There were speeches, celebrations, flag-waving crowds who knew only the legend, not the man. America in 1945 was hungry for heroes. The war was ending. Victory was at hand. And Maynard Snuffy Smith, whatever his faults, had done something truly extraordinary when it mattered most. The parade ended. The speeches faded. The crowds went home. And Snuffy Smith faced something far more challenging than fire at 30,000 feet. He faced civilian life. His post-war years were turbulent. There were legal troubles, business failures, money problems that echoed his pre-war existence. He married again, this time to a British woman named Mary Rayner, a USO volunteer he had met in England. They had 4 children together, a family that needed stability from a man who had never been stable in his life. Smith worked for the Treasury Department again, returning to the same kind of government job he had abandoned before the war. He founded a magazine called Police Officer's Journal. He bounced from one venture to another, never quite finding his footing, never quite achieving the success that his intelligence suggested was possible. But he never denied what he had done on May 1st, 1943. If anything, he embraced it. Over the years, he told and retold the story of that burning B-17. Sometimes he embellished details. Sometimes he added elements that may or may not have been accurate. That was Snuffy. He had always been a storyteller. He had always believed in his own mythology. The Medal of Honor opened doors for him. It provided opportunities. It gave him a platform that few Americans ever receive. But Smith could never quite capitalize on these advantages. His personality, the same personality that had made him unpopular at Thurleigh, continued to create obstacles wherever he went. The contrast haunted everyone who knew his story. How could a man capable of such extraordinary courage be so incapable of ordinary responsibility? How could someone who saved lives through sheer determination not apply that same determination to building a successful career? The answer lies in the nature of heroism itself. Heroism is not a character trait. It is a moment, a decision made in crisis when everything is falling apart. Some people rise to that moment and then return to exactly who they were before. The crisis reveals their potential. It does not transform their personality. Snuffy Smith rose to his moment. For 90 minutes over the English Channel, he became the best version of himself. He fought fire. He fought enemies. He saved lives. He did things that trained professionals would call impossible. And then he went back to being Snuffy Smith, the troublemaker, the rule breaker, the man who believed he was smarter than everyone around him, the hero nobody liked. In Part 4, you will discover what happened to Maynard Smith in the decades after the war. You will learn about his final years, his death, and his burial at Arlington National Cemetery, alongside presidents and generals. And you will understand why his story matters today, why the hero nobody liked still teaches us something important about courage, character, and the complicated nature of human beings. Because Snuffy Smith's story has one final chapter, and it is the chapter that explains everything. In Part 1, you met Maynard Snuffy Smith, the troublemaker who joined the military to avoid prison. In Part 2, you watched him fight fire at 30,000 feet for 90 minutes, saving everyone aboard his burning B-17. In Part 3, you learned the truth about what happened after the medal ceremony, how they found him peeling potatoes, how he used his hero status to skip duties, how he became the only Medal of Honor recipient in World War II to be demoted for poor job performance. Now comes the final chapter, the part of the story that reveals what heroism really means and what it costs. Because Maynard Smith lived for another 4 decades after the war ended. He raised a family. He worked jobs. He grew old. And in all those years, he never stopped being exactly who he had always been. The hero nobody liked carried that title to his grave. But here is the twist that nobody expected. In the end, Snuffy Smith found peace. Not through redemption, not through changing his ways, but through something far more complicated: acceptance. Maynard Smith returned to civilian life in May 1945 with a Medal of Honor around his neck and a demotion on his service record. He was 34 years old. He had a new wife, Mary Rayner, the British USO volunteer he had met in England. He had a reputation as both a hero and a troublemaker. He had skills learned in combat that meant nothing in peacetime. What do you do when you have done the most extraordinary thing you will ever do in your life, and you are not even 35 years old? Smith tried to figure it out. He took a job with the Treasury Department, returning to the same bureaucratic work he had abandoned before the war. It was steady. It was safe. It was boring. For a man who had fought fire at 30,000 feet, filing paperwork felt like a slow death. He and Mary had 4 children together, a family that needed stability, a family that needed a father who showed up on time, who followed rules, who provided consistent support. These were exactly the qualities that Maynard Smith had never possessed. The marriage survived, but it was not easy. Mary had seen something in Snuffy during the war, some spark of potential beneath his difficult exterior. She spent decades trying to nurture that spark while managing his worst impulses. Smith bounced between ventures in the years that followed. He founded a magazine called Police Officer's Journal, capitalizing on his military credentials and his ability to tell a good story. The magazine had moderate success before eventually fading away. He tried other business ideas. Some worked for a while. Most did not. Through it all, the Medal of Honor followed him like a shadow. It opened doors. It created opportunities. But it also created expectations that Smith could never quite meet. People expected Medal of Honor recipients to be paragons of virtue. They expected heroes to behave heroically in every aspect of their lives. Snuffy Smith was not that kind of hero. He continued to embellish his story over the years. The details grew more dramatic with each telling. The fire burned hotter. The Germans attacked more fiercely. The odds grew longer. That was who he was, a storyteller, a self-promoter, a man who believed in his own legend, even when the facts got fuzzy around the edges. But here is what matters. Despite his flaws, despite his difficult personality, despite every obstacle he created for himself, Maynard Smith endured. He raised his children. He stayed married. He kept working. He kept living. He did not collapse under the weight of his own contradictions. The man who could not follow simple rules somehow managed to follow the most important one. He kept going. The legacy of Maynard "Snuffy" Smith extends far beyond one burning aircraft over the English Channel. His story became part of the foundation for how the military understands heroism, training, and the psychology of combat. After the war, military psychologists studied cases like Smith's extensively. How did a man with no combat experience, a man everyone considered unreliable, perform so extraordinarily under pressure? What does that tell us about human potential in crisis situations? The answers transformed military training for decades. The lessons learned from Smith and others like him influenced how the armed forces prepare personnel for emergencies. Training programs began emphasizing stress inoculation, the idea that exposing people to controlled pressure helps them perform better under real pressure. Smith's actions also contributed to improvements in aircraft firefighting equipment. The B-17 he saved had minimal firefighting capabilities. A few small extinguishers, some blankets. That was it. In the years after World War II, military aircraft began carrying more sophisticated fire suppression systems, specifically because of incidents like the one Smith survived. Today, modern military aircraft carry automated fire suppression systems that can extinguish flames in seconds. Crews receive extensive training in emergency procedures. The lessons, written in blood and fire over the English Channel in 1943, echo through every safety protocol in modern aviation. The Medal of Honor itself carries Smith's legacy forward. He was the first of only 5 enlisted airmen to receive the award during World War II. His citation established precedents for how aerial heroism would be recognized and rewarded. Every Medal of Honor awarded to an Air Force enlisted member since then exists in the shadow of that first one, hanging around the neck of a troublemaker who happened to become extraordinary when it mattered most. The 8th Air Force Memorial in England bears witness to the 26,000 Americans who died in the strategic bombing campaign over Europe. Among the names and the statistics, Smith's story represents something unique. Not the clean heroism of propaganda posters, not the simple courage of men who followed orders without question. Something messier, something more human. Real courage, the memorial teaches, does not require perfection. It requires only the willingness to act when action is needed. What does Snuffy Smith's story teach us about heroism? About human nature? About the complicated relationship between character and courage? First, it teaches us that heroes are not made in comfortable circumstances. They are made in crisis. The same man who could not show up on time for a briefing became the man who fought fire for 90 minutes without stopping. The crisis did not change who he was. It revealed who he could be. Second, it teaches us that heroism is not a permanent state. It is a moment, a decision, a choice made when everything is falling apart. Smith made that choice on May 1st, 1943. He kept making it for 90 minutes. And then he went back to being exactly who he had always been. Third, it teaches us that the military, like any large institution, struggles to accommodate people who do not fit the standard mold. Smith was too difficult for peacetime service. He was too valuable for his commanders to dismiss entirely. The system never quite figured out what to do with him. History is full of similar examples. Billy Mitchell, the air power visionary, was court-martialed for insubordination while trying to prove that aircraft could sink battleships. George Patton, one of the greatest combat commanders in American history, nearly lost his career multiple times for slapping soldiers and making controversial statements. Innovation and obedience rarely coexist comfortably. The lesson applies beyond military contexts. Every organization, every company, every institution faces the same challenge. How do you accommodate difficult people who might also be capable of extraordinary things? How do you maintain discipline while leaving room for the unconventional? Smith's story offers no easy answers, but it asks the right questions. There is one detail about Maynard Smith that almost nobody knows. A small fact that explains everything about his complicated legacy. When Smith died on May 11, 1984, in St. Petersburg, Florida, at the age of 72, the military faced a decision. Where should a demoted Medal of Honor recipient be buried? He had earned the highest honor America can bestow on a soldier. He had also been reduced in rank for failing to meet basic standards of military conduct. The answer came from the regulations governing Arlington National Cemetery. Medal of Honor recipients are entitled to burial at Arlington, regardless of their subsequent service records. The medal trumps everything else. Forever. Maynard Harrison Smith was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, Section 8, Site 6135C. He lies among presidents, generals, and admirals. His simple white headstone looks identical to all the others around it. The Medal of Honor emblem is engraved above his name. Visitors to Arlington often walk past his grave without knowing the story. They see a name. They see the medal emblem. They assume he was a traditional hero, a man of spotless character and unblemished service. They do not know about the potatoes. They do not know about the demotion. They do not know about the personality that made him impossible to work with. They do not know that the soldier buried there was nicknamed after a lazy comic strip character. But perhaps that is exactly right. In death, Snuffy Smith became what he could never be in life. Anonymous. Unremarkable. Just another white headstone in a sea of white headstones. Just another American who served his country and earned his final resting place among heroes. The complicated, difficult, arrogant man disappeared. Only the hero remained. And maybe that is the final lesson of Snuffy Smith's story. History remembers what matters. It forgets what does not. In the end, what mattered about Maynard Smith was not his attitude or his punctuality or his personality. What mattered was 90 minutes over the English Channel, when he became more than the sum of his flaws. Let us put the entire story in perspective. On May 1, 1943, a 32-year-old troublemaker who had joined the military to avoid prison found himself alone in a burning aircraft at 30,000 feet. 3 of his crewmates had bailed out. 2 others were wounded. The pilots were trapped. German fighters were attacking. For 90 minutes, Maynard Snuffy Smith fought fire with extinguishers, then with clothing, then with his bare hands. He manned machine guns against enemy aircraft. He threw exploding ammunition out of burning holes in the fuselage. He treated wounded crewmates. He did everything that every rule and every manual said was impossible. When the aircraft landed and broke in half on the runway, everyone still aboard was alive. Because of him. Because a man nobody wanted to fly with refused to give up when giving up was the only rational choice. He became the first enlisted airman to receive the Medal of Honor. He was found peeling potatoes when they came to present it. He was demoted 18 months later for being impossible to work with. He spent the rest of his life as exactly what he had always been: difficult, arrogant, his own worst enemy. And when he died, they buried him at Arlington. That is the story of Maynard "Snuffy" Smith, the hero nobody liked, the soldier who proved that courage and character are two different things, the man who showed us that heroism can live in the most unlikely vessels. If you know another story of an unlikely hero from World War II, someone who defied expectations and changed history, share it in the comments. History is full of people like Snuffy Smith, people who rose to moments they were never supposed to survive, people whose flaws make their courage even more remarkable. Because here is the truth about heroism that Snuffy Smith teaches us. It does not care about your personality. It does not care if people like you. It does not care about your past mistakes or your character flaws. It only cares about what you do when everything is falling apart. For 90 minutes over the English Channel, a troublemaker became a legend. And legends, unlike people, live forever. That is the power of one moment, one choice. One man who refused to quit when quitting was the only sensible option. The soldier nobody wanted to fly with saved everyone who flew with him. And when the Secretary of War came to give him the highest honor his country could bestow, he was in the kitchen, peeling potatoes. That was Snuffy Smith. That will always be Snuffy Smith, the hero nobody liked.